This happened a few months ago when me and my boyfriend just got together. We both lived with our parents and wanted somewhere private to hang out, so he drove us out near some forest by his house so we could chill and make out in the back of his car undisturbed, or so we hoped. We had parked in a sort of parking spot surrounded by trees. It was around 11 p.m., so pitch black at this point, and we were the only car there. We both got out and got into the back seat of his car, and he got up YouTube on his phone so we could watch some videos for a while. Suddenly, a small white van drove into the parking circle and drove very slowly until it was behind us. Straight away, I start freaking out. Like, out of all the places this guy could park, he parked right behind us. My boyfriend is pretty calm, though, and laughs it off. Then this guy shines his lights in our car, and I'm freaking out even more. I'm telling my boyfriend we should just leave when the van starts driving again to pull up next to us. Figuring this guy wants to tell us something, my boyfriend leans over to the front seat and winds down the window. But the person in the van doesn't do the same. In fact, I can't even see what he looks like because everything's just pitch black except his front lights and our internal ones. My boyfriend winds the window back up and is now more freaked out than he first was. At that, the van reverses and is now behind us again, shining his lights once again in our car. At this point, I'm so done. I beg my boyfriend to climb over the seat and drive us away, and we speed off. Once we've been driving around for a while, we find a new spot to park and carry on with our original plan. I keep talking about how creepy the whole thing was, and we go through the possible reasons the guy was doing what he was doing. Eventually, we leave to drive home, and as we're driving back, we see the same van driving in the opposite direction. To make it worse, he brakes when he sees us, but my boyfriend has a really fast car, so he sped off before the van could turn and catch up with us, or whatever the hell he was trying to do. I still wonder if there was any innocence or a reasonable explanation for what he was doing, but naturally, my mind always goes to the creepy stuff. A few months back, I was in my apartment for the night. My other roommate came home after I was already asleep, and I have two more that were not home that are typically on the third floor. We have a 2-floor apartment, with the first floor being its own apartment as well. On this particular night, I was heading to bed fairly early because I had to be up around 5 a.m. the next day. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. because I have this lamp on my dresser that clinks when the floor shakes, which happens from me and others walking around the apartment typically. I chalked it up to the neighbors downstairs and tried to fall back asleep. No such luck. About 10 minutes later, my lamp started shaking, followed by what felt like my entire apartment shaking. I sat right up in bed, not really sure what was happening, and thinking it would probably stop. Of course it didn't. I got up out of bed, and I'm not sure what I thought walking around my apartment would accomplish, but I guess that's what most people do when they hear something strange. I walked out into my kitchen, and no sooner did I get a few feet did I see a guy with long dark hair start slamming his head against the banister on our deck. Luckily, I had not turned any lights on, and he was not facing me fully. I went back into my bedroom with my back against the door and listened as the shaking continued, and I phoned the cops. When the cops arrived, they found nobody there, and I confirmed that the banging had subsided. I thought that was the end of the story, and I basically stayed up until I had to leave at 5 a.m. because no fucking way am I sleeping after that. The next afternoon, I get back to the apartment, and the roommate who was home tells me that some guy came down from the upstairs in the morning and walked out. She thought it was one of my other roommate's boyfriends, and I told her they weren't home last night, and it was just us. We conferenced with our upstairs roommates, who confirmed that they were not home, and neither were their boyfriends staying there. My one roommate, whose window you can get to by climbing to the deck onto the roof, said that her window was open. Her bed was a mess, and the toilet seat upstairs was open like a guy had peed in it. Basically, some fucker slept in our apartment that night.
This particular event happened almost a year ago, sometime in mid-October. A couple friends and I drove out to visit an old friend of ours from high school, George, who now lived about an hour out of the city. We spent the whole day with him, and it was really late when we finally decided to start the drive back home. My friend Lisa was passed out in the passenger seat. She had had a few drinks and decided to spend the ride home asleep. My other friend Sam was sitting in the back seat behind Lisa and was playing a game on her smartphone. I, of course, was driving. I was following the GPS's instructions back to the freeway. At that moment, we were driving down a dark street with thick trees bordering both sides. Everything was pretty peaceful, with the only sounds I could hear being that of the car moving along the road and the radio on low volume. Suddenly, my car let out a loud jolt, and it felt as if I'd hit something. Sam let out a shocked scream while Lisa remained dead asleep. I slammed on the brakes and the car came to a halt. I was breathing heavily when I asked what the hell had just happened. Sam peered through the back window and gasped. She turned to me with an angry look on her face and shouted that I had just hit a dog. I looked through the back window, and sure enough, a dog was lying in the road a few yards behind the car. Sam is a pretty big animal lover, so I wasn't surprised to see her get pissed at me. She was about to open the door and rush to the animal's aid when I stopped her. Once I had gotten over the shock of running over a dog, I got a feeling in my gut that told me that something was off. I'm no braggart, but I consider myself to be a very attentive and safe driver. My eyes were on the road at all times, and I distinctly remember not seeing any dog in the road prior to the car jolting. Yes, it was dark, but I was sure that I would have at least seen the dog in the headlights before hitting it. I looked through the back window and took a closer look at the dog, or at least as much as I could make out in the reddish light coming from my taillights. It was a fairly big dog, at least a golden retriever or something like that. One particular detail caught my attention. I could see the dog's tail wagging. Now, I'm no expert on mannerisms of animals, but I was sure the last thing a dog would do after being hit by a car would be wagging its tail. After a moment of thought, I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and sped off. Sam snapped at me and ordered me to go back, and I told her that something was wrong with the whole situation. She continued to argue, but fell silent as she turned back towards the back window. She asked, "What the heck?" with a shaken voice. I looked in the rear-view mirror. Though it was dark, I was able to make out the silhouettes of 3 large figures emerging from the trees on the side of the road. The dog was now up on its feet and jumping around joyfully. The 3 figures looked in our direction as I pressed my foot down on the gas harder and sped off. Sam and I remained silent for the rest of the ride home. It wasn't until a few days later that we told Lisa about it. We've been back to visit George a few times since then, but we always make sure to leave before sunset. Still, I dread to think about what would have happened if we had gotten out of the car.
In college, I lived with my mom and my aunt. We had a house on a hill in the woods. You had to drive up to get to the garage, and the front yard sloped down to the left to expose all the floors of a pretty turret on the side of the house. To get to the front door, you had to step onto a wooden walkway that followed along the whole left side of the garage. There was about 4 feet between the bottom of the walkway and the ground underneath at the door. I got home late one night and saw my aunt's light was still on. She was a night owl like me. I pulled in, parked, and walked up to the front door. It was dark, but I could see there was something wrong with the doorknob. It was hanging out of the door and the screws were mostly out. I unlocked the deadbolt, locked it again, and went upstairs to ask my aunt what had happened to the knob. She was really confused and told me she had just been out there smoking and it was fine. I told her it was broken, and she argued that she had literally been out there only a minute before and hadn't even seen me pull in because she was still walking up the stairs to her room. We both go back downstairs, and I show her the door. Her face turned white, and we realized that in the time between her shutting the door and me getting to it, someone had tried to break in by pulling the locks out. We had many more instances after that with someone stalking us, but never found out who it was. This was the scariest thing, though, because I finally realized that whoever had done that hadn't had time to hide. There was nothing to hide behind in the front yard, except under the walkway I had been standing on, while I puzzled over what had happened to the door. My dad was out for a job interview, so me and my sister had the place to ourselves for about 2 hours. I watched TV downstairs and went outside, and when I went back in, I left the door unlocked for my dad, since it was getting close to the time he said he'd be home. I went upstairs and hung out with my sister for a while. I heard the front door open, and rummaging through cabinets as well. I just assumed that it was my dad, since he always liked to check everything is in its place before relaxing. I also heard my dad's door open and close, albeit slowly, a few times. I was talking with my sister when the phone rang. To my surprise, it was my dad on the other end. He told me that he was going to be getting home late, and that we needed to make our own dinners. I felt like my heart fell to my feet. As he said this, I realized that it wasn't my dad that had entered the home. I rushed downstairs to see if everything was okay. Several things were gone and the front door was wide open. I then heard what sounded like breathing coming from the downstairs bathroom. I choked the urge to yell as I saw a hand wrap around the door and a face appear around my corner. As soon as the guy saw me, he ran like hell out of there. I chased him, but he was long gone. On the floor in the bathroom, I found a box cutter. I'm not sure what his intentions were, but they weren't good, if anything. I called police soon after, but they could never find him. My dad always calls now when he's heading home to make sure I know he's still gone.